Welcome back to your channel. Before we begin our journey, we'd love to get to know our wonderful family around the world. Let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Thank you, enjoy the show, and let us know if you like the story. The high walls of the citadel of Ethelgard were not constructed merely to repel invading armies. To Princess Ilara, they seemed designed to suffocate the soul. Built of pale, shimmering limestone that caught the relentless glare of the sun, the palace was a masterpiece of architecture and a monument to isolation. From her balcony, which jutted out like a solitary tooth from the royal jaw of the castle, Ilara could see the sprawling city below, the capital. It was a chaotic, vibrant tapestry of terracotta roofs, winding cobblestone streets, and plumes of wood smoke that smelled of roasting chestnuts and pine. It was a world of color and noise, of life lived loudly and without the stifling corset of protocol. Up here, in the rarefied air of the court, everything was silent, polished, and cold. Ilara, at 20, possessed a beauty that poets described as ethereal, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes like polished jade. But her spirit was withering under the weight of silk and expectations. Her father, King Aldrich, was a man of iron will and frozen affections, viewing his daughter not as a child, but as a diplomatic asset to be traded for an alliance with the warlike kingdom of Oakhaven. The engagement ball was only a month away, a looming guillotine over Ilara's future. The stagnation became unbearable on a Tuesday evening, when the sunset bled crimson across the horizon and the distant sound of a lute drifted up from the lower city. Driven by a sudden, frantic need to feel something real, Ilara did the unthinkable. She dismissed her handmaidens early, feigning a migraine, and pulled a rough woolen cloak from an old chest she kept hidden, a relic from a play she had performed in as a child. With her golden hair tucked beneath a drab hood and her face smudged with soot from the fireplace, she slipped through the servants' passages, a labyrinth of stone she had memorized during a lonely childhood, and emerged into the cooling twilight of the city streets. The transition was violent and intoxicating. The air down here was thick with the scent of spices, unwashed bodies, and wet earth. Ilara moved through the throng, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was jostled, shouted at, and ignored, and it was magnificent. She found herself in the artisans' district, where the clang of hammers on anvils provided a rhythmic heartbeat to the evening. It was here, distracted by a stall selling glass trinkets, that she failed to notice the thief. A hand, quick as a viper, snatched the small velvet purse hidden in her cloak. She gasped, turning just in time to see a scrawny figure dart into an alleyway. Before she could cry out, a shadow detached itself from the doorway of a smithy. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace. The young man, perhaps a year or two older than Ilara, intercepted the thief with a casual extension of his boot, sending the pickpocket sprawling. With a firm but calm hand, he retrieved the purse and sent the thief scampering away with a stern warning. He turned to Ilara, and the breath caught in her throat. He was not handsome in the way the courtiers were. He had no powdered face or manicured beard. His skin was bronzed by the forge fire, his hair an unruly mop of raven black, and his face was smeared with grime. But his eyes, dark, intelligent, and fiercely alive, held a depth she had never seen in the vacuous gaze of the nobility. He wore a leather apron over a linen shirt that had seen better days, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle from years of shaping metal. "You should be more careful," he said, his voice a rough baritone that vibrated in the air between them. He held out the purse. "The wolves in this part of town have sharp teeth for lost sheep." Ilara reached out, her hand trembling slightly. As her fingers brushed his calloused palm, a shock of electricity seemed to arc between them. She quickly withdrew, remembering her disguise. "Thank you," she whispered, altering her voice to sound coarser. I was distracted." Clearly, he replied, a crooked grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wiped his hands on a rag. I'm Kale. If you're going to wander the sprawl, you might want to look less like you're terrified of your own shadow. I am not terrified, Ilara lied, lifting her chin in a gesture of innate defiance that almost gave her away. Kale laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to chase away the chill of the evening. Right, just lost. Come on, I'll walk you to the main road before someone else decides you look like an easy target. They walked together, an unlikely pair amidst the fading light. Kale spoke of the city with a cynicism that was tempered by love. He talked of the corruption of the guards, the struggle to buy coal for the forge, and the beauty of shaping iron into something useful. Ilara found herself speaking too, not of the palace, but of her love for art, her hatred of cages, and her longing for the sea. She didn't tell him her name, calling herself Lara, a seamstress's daughter. For an hour, she was not a princess. She was just a girl, walking beside a boy who looked at her not as a prize, but as a person. When they reached the boundary of the upper district, the separation felt like a physical wound. Will you be here tomorrow? She asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Kale looked at her, his expression unreadable in the shadows. I'm always at the forge, Lara. It's the one with the sign of the Iron Rose. Ilara returned to the palace with her heart on fire. The next weeks became a dangerous, exhilarating blur. Every few days, she would find a way to slip out, drawn to the heat of the forge and the man who wielded the hammer. She watched him work, mesmerized by the way he coaxed beauty from brutal steel. They sat on the roof of his small workshop, eating stale bread and cheese, watching the stars. She learned that Kael was an orphan, raised by the master smith who had recently passed, leaving him the shop but also his debts. She learned that he despised the monarchy, viewing the king as a tyrant who taxed the poor to pave the palace floors with gold. This stung Ilara, but she said nothing, terrified that the truth would shatter the fragile, beautiful world they had built. But secrets in a palace are like cracks in a dam. Eventually, the water bursts through. The king, dissatisfied with the craftsmanship of the royal armory, announced a commission for a new ceremonial gate for the royal gardens to be unveiled at the engagement ball. He demanded the city's finest smiths present their designs. Kale, desperate to pay off the debts and keep his forge, entered the competition. When Ilara heard the news, panic and hope warred within her. The day of the presentation arrived. The great hall was filled with the elite. Ilara sat on the dais beside her father and the visiting Duke Valerius of Oakhaven. Valerius was a man who looked like a predatory bird, with cold eyes and a smile that lacked all warmth. When Kale walked in, dressed in his best, which was still humble compared to the velvet of the court, Ilara stopped breathing. He presented his design, a gate of wrought iron entwined with roses, so delicate they looked as if they might wilt, symbolizing strength, protecting beauty. King Aldrich was impressed, a rare occurrence. You have the job, blacksmith, the king rumbled, but you will work here, within the palace grounds, to ensure it is ready for the betrothal. Kale bowed, and as he rose, his eyes locked with Ilara's. Time seemed to freeze. The color drained from Kale's face. The Lara he had laughed with, the girl he had held hands with on a soot-stained roof, was sitting on a throne, draped in purple silk and diamonds. The betrayal in his eyes was a physical blow to Ilara. She wanted to scream, to run to him, but she was frozen by the hundreds of eyes watching her. Kale stiffened, his jaw clenching, but he said nothing. He turned and marched out, his stiff back radiating fury. The following days were a torture of proximity. Kale set up a temporary forge in the royal gardens, the ringing of his hammer echoing through Alara's chambers. She tried to visit him, but he ignored her, focusing entirely on the metal, striking it with a violence that spoke of his anger. Finally, one evening, she dismissed her guards and approached him.
"Kale," she pleaded, her voice breaking. He didn't look up. "Go away, Your Highness. The air here is too thin for a commoner like me." "Please," she stepped closer, ignoring the heat of the portable forge. "I didn't lie about who I was inside. I only hid the cage I live in."
Kale dropped the hammer and spun around, his eyes blazing. "You let me speak of my hatred for your father. You let me dream of a future but the seamstress, while you were promised to a duke? Was it a game? A royal amusement to taste the grit of the poor before you settled into your silk sheets?"
"No." Ilara grabbed his soot-stained hands, pressing them against her chest. "It was the only time I have ever been alive. I love you, Cal. Not the crown, not the title. I love you." The raw honesty in her voice, the tears streaming down her face, broke through his defenses. The anger in his eyes melted into anguish. "Ilara," he whispered, using her true name for the first time. This is a death sentence for both of us."
"I don't care," she sobbed, and he pulled her into his arms. They kissed desperately, a collision of two worlds that were never meant to touch, hidden by the shadows of the very gate he was building for her marriage to another man. From then on, the garden became their sanctuary and their prison. They met under the cover of darkness, stealing moments of tenderness amidst the looming threat of the engagement ball. But the Duke Valerius was not a fool. He sensed the princess's coldness, her distracted gaze. He began to watch her, placing spies among the garden staff. 3 days before the ball, disaster struck. It was a stormy night, rain lashing against the palace. Alara had sneaked out to warn Kale that Valerius was suspicious, begging him to flee the city. They were huddled in the temporary workshop, the roar of the rain drowning their whispers. They did not hear the approach of the boots on gravel. The door burst open. Duke Valerius stood there, flanked by 6 royal guards, a cruel sneer twisting his lips. "So," he drawled, stepping into the light of the forge fire, "the rumors were true. The pristine flower of Apelgard has been rolling in the mud."
"Run, Kale!" Alara screamed, placing herself between the guards and the blacksmith. But Kale did not run. He picked up his hammer, his face set in grim determination. "I will not leave you." The fight was brutal and short. Kale fought with the strength of a man who wielded iron for a living, but he was outnumbered and unarmored. A guard's pike struck him in the shoulder, and he fell. Valerius laughed, a cold, dry sound. "Throw this filth in the dungeon, and the princess, take her to her father. Let the king see what his daughter has become." The confrontation in the throne room was the stuff of nightmares. King Aldrich sat upon the obsidian throne, his face a mask of terrifying calm. Ilara, drenched and shivering, stood before him. Valerius paced like a triumphant cat, recounting the treasonous affair. "He is a traitor," the king said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "He has defiled the royal line. He will be executed at dawn on the morning of the wedding, as a gift to you, Duke Valerius."
"No!" Ilara's scream tore from her throat. She fell to her knees. "Father, please! He did nothing but love me. If you kill him, you kill me. I will not marry Valerius. I will throw myself from the highest tower before I let you do this." The king looked at her, seeing not the obedient child, but a woman possessed by a ferocity he recognized. It was his own. But tradition was the bedrock of the kingdom. "You will marry Ilara, and you will forget him." She was locked in her tower, the windows barred. The palace prepared for the wedding, draped in banners of celebration that felt like funeral shrouds to the princess. Down in the dungeons, Kale lay in darkness, his wound untreated, listening to the distant sounds of the city he would never see again. But he was not alone in spirit. The guards, many of whom were from the lower city and knew of Kale's kindness and the quality of his steel, whispered. The story of the princess and the blacksmith had leaked. It spread through the servants' quarters, out the delivery gates, and down into the sprawl. The city was restless. They saw in Kale one of their own, and in Ilara, a princess who had chosen the heart of the people over the power of the elite. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and cruel. The cathedral gates opened. The crowds gathered, but they were not cheering. There was a sullen, heavy silence in the streets. Ilara was dressed in a gown of white lace, diamonds heavy around her neck, her face pale as death. She was marched towards the altar, where Duke Valerius waited, looking smug. King Aldrich stood by the side, watching the crowd, sensing the tension in the air. As the high priest began the ceremony, a low rumble began outside. It grew louder, like thunder rolling up from the earth. The great doors of the cathedral groaned. Suddenly, the shouts of guards were heard. The doors burst open, not by force of wind, but by the pressure of a massive crowd pushing through the cordon. And leading them, supported by two burly smiths, was Kael. He had not escaped by magic, but by the loyalty he had earned. The jailer, a man whose son Kale had once made a leg brace for without charge, had left the cell unlocked. The people of the sprawl had stormed the outer perimeter, creating chaos. Kale stumbled into the nave, blood seeping through his tunic, but his head held high. "I object," his voice, though weak, carried through the silent hall. Valerius drew his sword. "Kill him," he shrieked at the royal guards. But the guards hesitated. They looked at the king, then at the princess, then at the man who stood unarmed against a duke. Ilara tore off her veil. She ran down the aisle, not away from the altar, but toward Kale. She stood before him, shielding him with her body. "If you strike him, you strike the future queen," she declared, her voice ringing with a power she had never known she possessed. She turned to her father. "Father, look around you. The city is here. They do not want a marriage of politics. They want a kingdom of heart. Valerius cares nothing for Ethelgard. He only wants your armies. Kale would die for this city. He would die for me." Valerius, enraged by the humiliation, lunged forward, thrusting his sword toward Kale over Ilara's shoulder. It was a cowardly move, but before the blade could connect, a deafening clang rang out. King Aldrich had drawn his own great sword, intercepting the duke's blow with a shower of sparks. The hall gasped. The king stepped down from the dais, his presence towering. He looked at Valerius with cold contempt. "You draw a weapon in the house of gods? You attack my daughter? She is a traitor," Valerius spat. "She is my daughter," Aldrich growled, "and she speaks the truth. I have seen your correspondence, Valerius. I know of your plans to leverage my armies for your own wars once I am gone. I ignored it for the sake of stability, but I will not sacrifice my blood for a snake." He turned to Kale, who was swaying, holding on to Ilara. The king's eyes were hard, but not without a glimmer of respect. "You have caused a great mess, blacksmith." "I only loved your daughter, sire," Kale gasped. The king looked at the crowd, the sea of common faces mixing with the terrified nobility. He saw the shift in the tide. The old ways were breaking, and if he did not bend, the palace would indeed shatter. "The wedding is canceled," King Aldrich announced.
Guards, escort Duke Valerius to the border. If he returns, his head will adorn the gates." As Valerius was dragged away, shouting curses, the king sheathed his sword. He looked at Alara, whose face was radiant with tears and disbelief. "He is not of noble birth, Alara. The court will not accept this easily." "Then we will change the court," Alara said firmly, gripping Kael's hand. "We will build something new, stronger, like iron and rose." The king sighed, a sound that seemed to release years of tension. He gestured to the royal physicians. "Get the boy some help. If he dies on my carpet, I'll be very annoyed."
The days that followed were not a fairy tale of instant perfection. There was scandal, there was resistance from the High Lords, and there was the difficult reality of integrating a blacksmith into the royal family. But the love between Alara and Kael became the foundation of a new era for Ethelgard. Kael never stopped working the forge. Instead, he moved it into the palace grounds permanently. He taught the king that strength came not just from stone walls, but from the hands that built them. And Alara, finally free of her cage, ruled not from a pedestal, but alongside the man who had shown her that the most precious things in life are not gold or diamonds, but the warmth of a hand held in the dark and the courage to be true. The palace did not fall, but it was shaken to its core, and when the dust settled, it was no longer a prison, but a home. Yet, the definition of home is a fluid thing, shifting like the tides against the cliffs of the coast. And for Kael, the transition from the soot-stained air of the sprawl to the perfumed corridors of the citadel was a disorientation as profound as deep-sea bends. The wound in his shoulder healed, leaving a jagged ridge of scar tissue that Alara would trace with her fingertips in the quiet hours of the night, a map of the violence that had purchased their freedom. But the healing of the kingdom's social fracture was a far slower, more agonizing process. The nobility, stripped of their primary weapon, tradition, resorted to a warfare of whispers and cold shoulders that was far more insidious than Duke Valerius's sword. For the first month, Kael was a ghost in the palace, a man caught between two existences. The servants, his former peers, bowed to him with a reverence that made him flinch, their eyes averting from his as if he had become a different species entirely. The lords and ladies, conversely, looked right through him, their gazes sliding over his presence as though he were a piece of misplaced furniture. He was given a suite of rooms adjacent to Alara's, filled with tapestries depicting ancient battles and furniture carved from mahogany so dark it looked like petrified shadow. He hated it. That victory was the turning point, but it was not the end of the struggle. Kael spent the next weeks not in the palace, but in the mud and snow of the city, working alongside the masons and carpenters. He didn't just command, he lifted stones, he hammered nails, he shared his rations. Alara, defying protocol, joined him. She didn't wield a hammer, but she organized the kitchens, setting up soup kitchens in the squares, listening to the grievances of the women, holding the children who had never seen a princess up close. The image of the princess in a wool cloak, her boots muddy, standing beside the blacksmith prince who was covered in dust, became a new icon for the kingdom. It was no longer a distant, ethereal monarchy. It was tangible. It was real. However, the shadow of the past had one final card to play. The Iron Rose Gate, the project that had started it all, remained unfinished in the royal gardens. It stood as a skeleton of rusted iron, abandoned since Kael's arrest. As the winter solstice approached, Kael felt a compulsion to finish it. It was no longer a commission for a false wedding. It was a testament to their survival. He worked on it at night, the only time he had to himself. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal became a lullaby for the palace. But metal has a memory, and iron can be brittle if not tempered correctly. One freezing night, 3 days before the solstice, Kael was heating a massive section of the intricate rose vines. He was alone, having dismissed the guards to focus. He didn't hear the intruder until the distinct sound of a crossbow bolt clicking into place echoed off the stone walls.
Kael dropped to the ground instinctively, the bolt whizzing past his ear and sparking against the anvil. He rolled behind the unfinished gate, peering through the iron roses. Standing at the entrance of the garden was not a soldier, but a figure cloaked in the livery of the exiled Duke Valerius, a loyalist assassin left behind to settle the score. "The Duke sends his regards, gutter rat," the assassin hissed, reloading with terrifying speed. Kael was unarmed. His hammer lay on the anvil, exposed. He looked around, his mind racing. He was cornered. The assassin stepped closer, raising the crossbow. "You ruined everything," the man spat. "Order, lineage, destiny." "Destiny is what you forge," Kael shouted back, his hand closing around a pair of long, heavy tongs he had been using in the fire. The ends were glowing cherry red. The assassin laughed and fired. Kael moved, not away, but forward. He deflected the bolt with the heavy iron of the gate itself, the wood shattering against the metal roses, and then he lunged. He didn't have a sword, but he had the reach of the tongs. He thrust the glowing metal forward, not to kill, but to disarm. The red-hot iron clamped around the assassin's crossbow, scorching the wood and the man's hand. The assassin screamed, dropping the weapon. Kael didn't stop. He swung the heavy tongs like a club, striking the man across the chest, sending him sprawling into the snow. By the time the royal guards, alerted by the shout, burst into the garden, Kael was standing over the intruder, his chest heaving, the glowing tongs illuminating his face in a demonic red light. Alara arrived moments later, wrapped in a dressing gown, her hair loose. She saw the assassin, the weapon, and Kael. She didn't scream. She walked to him, stepping over the groaning man, and took the cooling tongs from Kael's shaking hands. "Are you hurt?" she asked, scanning him for blood. "No," Kael breathed, the adrenaline fading to leave a cold tremble in his limbs. "Just unfinished business." The attempted assassination did not incite fear, it incited fury. But this time it was not the king's fury, it was the people's. When news spread that a remnant of the old regime had tried to kill the blacksmith prince, the city didn't riot, they rallied. On the day of the solstice, the crowds that flooded the palace grounds were not just looking for food, they were forming a human shield around their new leaders. King Aldrich, watching from the high balcony, saw the sea of faces, commoners intermingled with the lower nobility who had sensed the shifting winds. He turned to Alara and Kael, who stood beside him. "I spent 40 years trying to keep them out, to keep us safe," the king murmured, his voice tinged with a strange mixture of regret and pride. "I never realized that the walls were the danger." He stepped back. "Go, address them. They are yours now." Alara took Kael's hand. His palm was rough, calloused and scarred, the hand of a maker. She led him to the railing. Below them, the unfinished iron rose gate had been moved to the center of the courtyard. Kael had finished it the night after the attack, pouring all his defiance into the final welds. It was a masterpiece of paradox, sharp thorns protecting delicate petals, brutal iron curved into organic life. It stood open, not closed. As they stepped into the winter sunlight, a roar went up from the crowd that shook the very limestone of the citadel. It wasn't the polite applause of the court. It was a raw, guttural sound of acceptance. Kael looked at Alara, the woman who had climbed out of a window to find a life, and then at the city that had climbed up the hill to find a soul. "We have a lot of work to do," Kael whispered to her, the reality of the years ahead settling on his shoulders, the politics, the economy, the endless struggle to balance the scales. Alara smiled, and for the first time her smile reached her eyes, bright as the winter sun. "I know," she replied, tightening her grip on his hand, "but the forge is hot, and the iron is ready." The story of the princess and the blacksmith did not end with a wedding, nor with a crown. It continued in the daily grind of governance, in the arguments over tax laws, in the quiet evenings watching the city lights, and in the slow, steady reshaping of a kingdom that learned, finally, that the strongest metal is not found in the ground, but in the human heart. And though the walls of Athelgard remained high, they never again felt like a cage, for the door was always, finally, open.